The vote was already done by the time I walked into the chamber. 847 species. Every seat filled. The kind of silence that only happens when something enormous has just been decided, and everyone in the room knows it, but nobody wants to be the first to breathe. I am Vale Tor, Senior Ambassador of the Xernathi Collective, and I have sat in that chamber for 31 years. I have watched treaties signed. I have watched wars ended. I have watched civilizations absorbed, dissolved, and quietly erased from the record of living things. I had never, in 31 years, felt the air in that chamber the way I felt it that morning. The vote counter above the Grand Rostrum read 847 to 0. Grand Executor Solène stood at the center dais with all four of her arms raised, and the chamber was erupting around her, and I stood at the back and I looked at that number, and I could not make myself move toward my seat. 847 to 0. We had declared war on Earth. It had taken 18 months to reach this point. 18 months of the humans sending their diplomats in those small, almost embarrassingly modest ships, talking about sovereignty, about equal standing, about what they called their right to exist without conditions attached. They spoke in perfect galactic standard, grammatically correct to a level that made our own linguists uncomfortable, because a species that young had no business being that precise in a language they had only known for 30 years. They were calm. They were consistent. They were, to put it plainly, not afraid of us, and that refusal to be afraid had become, over 18 months, the thing that irritated the Council more than anything else the humans had done. So the Council voted. 847 to 0. I found my seat. I clapped the way my species claps. Around me, 846 other species were doing their version of the same thing, and the sound filled the chamber, and the vote counter kept reading 847 to 0, and I kept looking at it. 3 weeks ago, the humans had stopped responding to our communications, not arguing, not threatening, not sending one of their precise, perfectly worded transmissions that always somehow managed to be polite and faintly unnerving at the same time. Just nothing. 3 weeks of complete silence from a pale blue planet at the edge of a medium-sized spiral arm, a planet that had been spacefaring for 273 years, a planet that had exactly one space station of real size, one colonized moon, and a defensive fleet that our tactical division had assessed as manageable in under a week. Councillor Brios found me after the vote at the reception. He handed me a glass of something from his homeworld. It tasted like mineral water mixed with the memory of a bad decision. "You look troubled," he said. "The humans stopped responding 3 weeks ago," I said. He waved a tentacle. "Fear. They finally understand what they face." I drank from my glass and looked at the room full of celebrating species and said nothing. Fear. That is what we told ourselves. It was the explanation that fit. It was the explanation that made the vote feel clean, made the number 847 to 0 feel like a conclusion instead of a beginning. The humans had gone quiet because they were afraid. I wanted to believe that. I had been trying to believe it for 3 weeks. I have spent 31 years learning how fear behaves. Fear argues. Fear pleads. Fear sends increasingly desperate transmissions at all hours. Fear does not go silent and stay silent for 21 days, while the largest military coalition in galactic history assembles at its borders. I put my glass down and looked across the celebrating room and felt, for the first time in a long career, something I did not have a clean word for. It sat in my chest like a stone. On the way back to my quarters that night, I passed the communications wing, the long corridor where our relay officers sit at their stations around the clock, monitoring frequencies, logging contacts, managing the endless flow of information that keeps a council of 847 species functioning. I stopped at the window. Inside, one of the relay officers had a message open on her screen, Earth frequency. She was staring at it. The message field was empty. She felt me watching and looked up. There was something in her face that a younger version of me would have called professional concern. I was old enough to call it what it actually was. She was scared. Not of the fleet we were sending, not of the political consequences of the vote. She was scared of the message field, of what it meant, that it was empty. I walked on. I went to my quarters. I sat at my desk with the lights of the station around me, and I pulled up the tactical assessment files our military division had prepared over the last 18 months. I read the numbers, fleet strength, weapons capability, response time, projected casualty models. Our analysts had been thorough. They had modeled every scenario except one. What if the silence was not fear? What if the humans had stopped arguing because they were done arguing? What if 21 days of silence was not an ending but a kind of preparation? I closed the files. I sat in the dark. The vote counter in my memory kept reading 847 to 0, and I could not make it feel like the right number it had looked like in the chamber. Outside my window, the first ships of the assembled fleet were beginning to move. Engines lit against the dark. Beautiful, in the way that large organized things are always beautiful, before you understand what they are organized for. I watched them go. I turned the stone in my chest over and over, and I did not sleep. The fleet reached the outer boundary of human space on day 6. We knew this because our long-range sensors confirmed it. We also knew it because the human government sent a single transmission at the exact moment our lead vessels crossed the boundary line. Not a protest, not a demand for negotiation, not an ultimatum. 3 words. In perfect galactic standard. We see you. That was all. Brios was in my office when the transmission came through. He read it and said it was a bluff. He said it was exactly the kind of thing a frightened species does when they have run out of real options. He said it with the confidence of someone who has been right about things for a long time and has not yet encountered the thing that will make him wrong. I read the 3 words again. We see you. Not we will fight you, not we warn you, not we are afraid of you. We see you. As if they had been watching all along, as if the fleet crossing their border was a thing they had been expecting, had been tracking, had built into some calculation we did not have the model for. I did not tell Brios what I was thinking. I pulled up the tactical feeds and I watched our fleet advance into human space, and I thought about 21 days of silence, and 3 words, and the way the relay officer had looked at the empty message field. And I thought about what it means when something stops talking to you. Not because it is afraid, but because it is ready. On day 8, the first engagement began. I was in the council observation room when the initial reports came in. Clean feeds, clinical language, Fleet Marshal Dren Voss commanding the 4th Strike Armada, moving to engage the human defensive line at the outer lunar perimeter. The tactical models had given us 6 hours for the first phase. 6 hours to scatter the human fleet and establish orbital dominance. The first report came in at hour 1. A single human vessel had materialized off the port stern of the flagship at a distance our sensors should have flagged before it got within weapons range. It fired once. It took out the entire sensor array of the lead ship. It was gone before a single gun could track it. I read that report 3 times. Then I sat down. Because in 31 years of watching this council manage conflicts, I had never read a sentence like that. Not from a species 273 years into space. Not from anyone. The stone in my chest got heavier. I looked at the 847 to 0 on my desk screen, where I had kept it open all week because I kept thinking it would eventually feel like the right number. It did not feel like the right number. Outside, our fleet was advancing, the largest military coalition ever assembled in this galaxy. 847 species, centuries of combined military history, weapons technology that could crack a moon. And one small human ship had just made our best sensors look like they were not there. 3 weeks of silence. We see you. I stood up from my chair and walked to the window and looked out at the dark, and I said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "What have we done?" Nobody answered. The fleet kept moving. And somewhere in human space, in the silence we had mistaken for fear, something was waiting that we did not have a model for. That was the first day. It was the easiest day of what came after. Fleet Marshal Dren Voss had been in command of warships for 22 years, and he had a rule about coffee. His rule was that he did not drink it. He had watched too many junior officers let the ritual of a hot drink become a kind of emotional anchor during tense operations, something to hold when things got difficult, and he believed that an anchor on a ship was for stopping, not for moving forward. He did not want anything on his bridge that helped people stop. His junior sensor officer, Preth, had no such philosophy. She brewed her coffee at the start of every shift. The whole bridge smelled of it within minutes. Strong, dark, the kind that humans apparently grew in mountainous regions on their homeworld. She ordered it from a trader at Relay Station 9. paid far too much for it, and drank it with the focused attention of someone performing a small ceremony. She was particular about temperature. She had, on one occasion, sent a cup back to the galley because it was 2 degrees below what she considered correct. Voss had said nothing about this because Preth was the finest censor officer he had ever served with, and some arrangements are worth their cost. On the morning of Day 8, when the 4th Strike Armada crossed into the outer engagement zone, Preth brewed her coffee at shift change as usual. She set it beside her console. She pulled up the long-range sensor feeds. She began running the pre-engagement diagnostics. She did not drink the coffee. Voss noticed at the 40-minute mark. By that point, they were 30 minutes into what should have been the opening phase of a clean, well-modeled operation, and the human fleet was doing something that none of their models had prepared them for. The human ships had split. Not in the way that a fleet splits when it is trying to form up into defensive positions, not in the way that a fleet splits when it is panicking, but in a way that had no pattern Preth could identify, every vessel moving on its own vector, unpredictable, and the predictive intercept calculations that their tactical systems had been running were coming back wrong, not slightly wrong, completely wrong. Each projection they generated was dead wrong by the time they tried to act on it. Prith's coffee sat untouched. Voss came and stood behind her station. He looked at her screen. He looked at her coffee. He looked back at her screen. "Talk to me," he said. "The human vessels are not engaging in any formation I can read," Preth said. Her voice had a quality he associated with her processing something that did not fit existing categories. He had heard it from her 3 times in 22 years of service. "Every ship is moving independently on a vector I cannot predict more than 4 seconds in advance, and they are not attacking us." "They're running!" She paused. "No, sir. They are not on retreat vectors. They are not on approach vectors. They are on vectors that, and I want to be precise about this, I cannot classify using any tactical model in our system." "What does our system say they are?" "It gives error codes." She turned and looked at him. Her secondary eyes, the ones that only opened when her nervous system was working overtime, were fully open. "I have never received error codes from our tactical system during an active engagement. In 20 years. He opened his mouth. The proximity alarm cut him off. It was not a gentle alarm. It was the sound that meant something was very close, that should not be very close. The sound that Voss had only heard twice in his career, both times as a young officer, and both times in training simulations. He had not heard it in a real engagement, because in a real engagement, you had sensor coverage that prevented things from getting to proximity range without warning. They had sensor coverage. The human ship was at 20 meters off the port stern. 20 meters. In the time it took Voss to process that number, the human ship fired. 1 shot. The flagship's entire external sensor array went dark simultaneously, every feed going to static, in a cascade that his engineering officer would later describe as not like anything a weapons system should be able to produce, more like someone had found the exact frequency that made the sensors tell themselves to stop working. The proximity alarm cut out. Every external feed was dark. By the time 3 of his gunnery stations had rotated their tracking to where the human ship had been, the human ship was not there. Prith ran a sweep. Nothing. It was gone. Not destroyed. Not disabled. Gone. The bridge was quiet. Voss looked at the dark sensor feeds. He looked at his gunnery officers looking back at him. He looked at the empty space where 20 meters away a ship had just materialized, fired, and left. He looked at Preth's coffee. Cold. "How long has that been sitting there?" he said, because he needed to say something, and that was what came out. Prith looked at the cup. "Since shift start, sir." "You haven't drunk it." "No, sir." She picked it up and then put it down again. "Sir, when we first picked up the human fleet on our deep-range sensors, I started going through their military history while we were advancing. For context." Voss waited. "They have been running naval engagements for 4,000 years, on their own planet, against each other, naval tactics, fleet coordination, weapons targeting, sensor evasion." She gestured at the dark feed screens. "Everything we just saw, they have been doing it for 4,000 years. He let that sit. "We have been doing it," he said. "For how long?" The Zernathi Collective's first recorded space naval engagement was 912 years ago. She picked up her coffee again, did not drink it, set it down. But we were not fighting anyone who had been doing this longer than us. We were fighting each other, or species who had been doing it for 300 years. 400. We have never, as far as I can find in our records, engaged a species that had been running coordinated military operations, even on a planetary scale, for 4,000 consecutive years. The damage report from the engineering team began coming through. The sensor array was not simply knocked offline. It had been targeted at the junction points, the 17 specific locations where taking out the connection would bring down the whole grid simultaneously. Whoever fired that shot had known the exact architecture of their sensor array. Voss read the report. He read it again. They knew our sensor architecture. Yes, sir. We have never given them access to our sensor architecture. No, sir. He turned and walked to the command chair and sat down. Around him, his bridge crew was in motion, running diagnostics, bringing backup systems online, doing the work of a professional military crew in a crisis. They were good at their jobs. They were the best crew in the 4th Armada, which was the best armada in the Zernathi Collective, which had the most decorated military record of any species in the Council. In the last 11 minutes, one small human vessel had done something to them that nothing else had managed in 912 years. Get me the other Armada commanders, Voss said. All of them, secure channel. Yes, sir. And someone get Preth a fresh coffee. Hot, the temperature she likes it. Nobody moved for a moment. Then one of the junior officers stood and went to the galley. Preth stared at her cold cup and said nothing. The secure channel opened. Fleet commanders from 14 species appeared on the split screen. They all looked exactly the way Voss felt, like people who had just run a calculation that came out to a number they did not expect. Status reports, Voss said. They came in. 14 commanders. Different sectors, different engagements, same essential story. Human ships moving on unpredictable vectors. Intercept calculations failing. Targeted strikes on specific vulnerable points that no external party should have known about. 3 more flagships with damaged sensor grids. 1 cruiser with its navigation system down. No human ships destroyed. No human ships even slowed. No human ships at all, in fact, that any of them had gotten a clean targeting lock on for more than 6 seconds. Commander Rel, of the Heth Voran fleet, pulled up a visual feed. A human vessel, mid-sized by their standards, moving through a debris field at a speed that was not technically impossible, but that their tactical computers had flagged as inadvisable. It moved like it had decided the laws of physics were strong suggestions. We cannot get a lock on that, Rel said. It changes direction faster than our targeting can compensate. Our system says it should not be able to move like that at that speed. What does it say when you try to target it? Voss asked. Error codes. Preeth's fresh coffee arrived. She wrapped both hands around the cup and drank from it, and stared at the screen and said nothing. We need to pull back to regroup, said Commander Fass of the Teluan Armada. We need to reassess our tactical models. Agreed, said 4 others simultaneously. We need to report to the Council, said Rel. Yes, said Voss. We do. He thought about how to report what had happened. He was a man who had filed thousands of reports in 22 years, and he had never once struggled to find the right words for what had occurred. Military language was precise. Things happened, and you described them. He did not have words for this. We engaged the human defensive fleet, he said slowly, testing the sentence. They performed in ways not anticipated by our models. We are reassessing. That is accurate, said Rel. That is technically accurate. We should also note, said Preth, from behind her coffee cup, without looking up, that this was their defensive fleet. These are the ships they kept at home. Our intelligence profiles suggest they have a separate class of vessel they have been working on for 6 years. A class that has never been deployed, and that we have never seen in operation. Everyone on the channel was quiet. How do you know that? Fass said. I have been reading their publicly available technical journals, Preth said. They publish them. Anyone can access them. They have been writing about the development of this vessel class for 6 years, in papers available on open networks. She paused. We did not read them. Another silence. Why did our intelligence division not read them? Voss asked. Preth looked up from her coffee. I do not know, sir. I only know that I read them this morning, while we were advancing, and I thought it was probably not relevant at the time. because the assessment said the human fleet would not be a serious challenge. And now? She looked back down. Now, I think perhaps we should read more of their publications. Voss ordered the pullback. The Armada commanders agreed without argument, which in itself told him something about the morning. These were not people who agreed without argument. These were military commanders with centuries of combined experience and institutional pride, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged. They agreed without a word of disagreement, because they had all read the same error codes, and seen the same unexplainable movements, and heard the same damage reports, and the agreement was the sound of 8 senior military professionals encountering a problem they did not have a pre-existing answer for. The fleet pulled back 40,000 kilometers and held position. On the screens, the human ships did not pursue. They also did not retreat. They held their own position, just inside the boundary of what was technically human-claimed space, and they sat there, waiting. Prith's coffee was hot, and she drank the whole cup. Then she opened the first of 300 human technical publications she had found in their public database and started reading. By the time she reached the 48th paper, she had stopped drinking coffee. She had stopped because her hands were not quite steady enough to hold the cup without spilling it, and she was a precise person and she did not want to spill anything. The 48th paper was titled, in the human's own language, something that translated roughly as Lessons from 4 Millennia of Naval Conflict and Their Application to Deep Space Engagement. It had been published openly, on a public database, 2 years ago. She called for Voss. He read it. He called the council. The report he filed was the hardest thing he had written in 22 years. Not because it was long, because it was honest. And what it said honestly was that they had spent 18 months looking at what the humans were, and had not once looked at what the humans had been. What they had done to each other, across 4,000 years of continuous conflict on a single planet. What they had learned and built and survived and adapted through. And that oversight, that single oversight, had just cost them a morning that Voss would spend the rest of his career trying to explain. He sent the report. He sat back in his command chair. He looked at the space ahead, where the human ships were holding position at the boundary. Preeth, he said. Sir, what else are they writing about in those publications? She was quiet for a moment. A great deal, sir. They write about everything. They publish studies on their own failures, post-engagement analyses, things that went wrong and why, tactical weaknesses they found in their own systems, and how they corrected them. She paused. They write about us too, sir. There are 47 papers in this database, specifically about the Zirnathi Collective, our fleet structures, our tactical preferences, our known sensor architectures. He was very still. And they are just public. Anyone can read them. Yes, sir. Available on their open research network for between 2 and 6 years. He looked at the boundary where the human ships were waiting. How many of our tactical people have access to their open research network? He asked. He knew the answer before she gave it. None, sir. The standard protocol is that we gather intelligence through observation and through our own networks. We do not typically monitor what other species publish about themselves. Because most species do not publish documents about their own vulnerabilities. Correct, sir. He was quiet for a long time. Because, he said finally, most species would consider that dangerous. Yes, sir. The humans publish it anyway. Yes, sir. Why? Prith thought about it for a moment, long enough that he knew she was not giving him a quick answer, but an actual one. I think, she said carefully, because they are not afraid of people knowing their weaknesses. I think they publish it because they believe that by the time anyone who reads it tries to use it against them, they will already have fixed the weakness and moved on to something new. He sat with that. The human ships held position at the boundary, waiting. Voss thought about what it meant to be the kind of species that published its own vulnerabilities because it was confident it would outrun them. He did not have a clean word for what he felt. He pulled up the communication channel to the council. There were things he needed to say, and none of them were going to make anyone in that chamber happy. And he was going to say them anyway, because the alternative was pretending the morning had gone differently than it had. He took a breath. He began to speak. I was in my office when the call came from the fleet. It was the kind of call that career diplomats spend 30 years hoping they never have to relay. Voss's voice on the channel was controlled, measured. The voice of a professional who has decided that the most useful thing he can do is be very precise about very difficult information. He spoke for 14 minutes. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, the channel was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Say the last part again." He said it again. I thanked him and closed the channel and sat at my desk for a while. The last part was about the publications, about 47 papers, specifically about the Zirnathi Collective, about a public human research database that our Tactical Intelligence Division had never looked at, about an entire body of work on human military history and development and adaptation that had been sitting in open, accessible space for years, and that we had simply not read, because we did not read things that other species published about themselves, because other species did not do that. I called an emergency session of the council for the next morning. Then I opened my own connection to the human research database. I found it in under 3 minutes. It was not hidden. There was no security around it. I typed in Zirnathi Collective and received 47 results organized by publication date, the oldest from 5 years ago, and the most recent from 8 months back. I opened the most recent one and started reading. They had our fleet entry patterns. They had documented our standard formation preferences across 9 previous engagements against other species that we had not considered classified because there seemed no reason to. They had our sensor array architecture. They had analysis of our weapons targeting algorithms, noting a predictable timing lag between target acquisition and firing that they called, in the paper, a structural limitation we had carried forward from early system designs and apparently never addressed. We had never addressed it because no one had ever been fast enough to exploit it. I read for 4 hours. By the time I stopped, I had read 11 of the 47 papers, and what I had read had changed the shape of my understanding of what the last 18 months had been. We had spent 18 months watching the humans arrive in their modest ships and speak their careful words, and we had seen a young species pleading for standing it had not earned. We had seen the whole thing as the humans reaching upward toward us, trying to be taken seriously by civilizations many centuries their elder. What the papers described was something different. They described a species that had spent 3 years, before its first diplomatic contact with the Council, mapping our fleets, studying our tactical histories, analyzing our political structures, reading everything we had published, and everything we had inadvertently revealed through our own public records, and building a working model of the Council's collective military capability and political decision-making patterns. The first diplomatic mission had not been the beginning of something. It had been the end of a preparation phase. They had arrived at that first meeting already knowing what we were. We had arrived not knowing what they were. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went to bed. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and thought about the stone that had been in my chest since the day of the vote. The thing I had not had a word for. I had a word for it now. Recognition. The feeling you get when you understand, too late, that you have been looking at something from the wrong direction the entire time. The emergency council session the next morning was the most difficult I had attended in 31 years. Not because of the shouting, though there was shouting. Not because of the competing theories and blame and proposals, though there was plenty of all three. It was difficult because at some point in the middle of it, somewhere in the 3rd hour, the chamber fell into one of its periodic silences, and in that silence, someone, I never found out who, pulled up the vote counter from the declaration session and put it on the main display. 847 to 0. We all looked at it. Nobody said anything. I think we were all doing the same thing. We were looking at that number, and we were revising it. We were understanding that it did not mean what we had thought it meant. It was not the number of a unified galaxy standing against one small presumptuous planet. It was the number of 847 civilizations that had looked at a species and seen only what that species allowed them to see. Councillor Brios, sitting 2 seats to my left, was very still. He was looking at the number the same way I was. He had his hands flat on the table in front of him. 3 weeks ago he had told me the silence from Earth was fear. He did not say anything in the session. Not for a long time. The reports came in through the day. Not all bad. Nothing catastrophic. Our fleets had pulled back and were regrouping, and there had been no further engagement. The humans were holding at the boundary and, in a development that nobody in the room quite knew what to do with, had sent a single communication to the council at noon. 2 words. When ready. Grand Executor Solane read it aloud. The chamber was very quiet. When ready. Not a demand, not a threat, not a victory announcement, an accommodation. A space left open for us to collect ourselves and decide what we wanted to do next. As if they had anticipated this exact moment, this specific morning of a council scrambling to reorganize its understanding, and had prepared a 2-word message for it. Brios finally spoke in the late afternoon session. He said, quietly, that perhaps the humans had not gone silent 3 weeks ago because of fear. He said this with the careful tone of someone who has revised a position and is being precise about the revision without dramatizing it. I said nothing. I had nothing to add to it. The session ended without a clear resolution. We would need more sessions. We would need to talk to our fleet commanders. We would need to do a great many things, including, I thought but did not say aloud, read 47 papers that had been sitting in a publicly accessible database for the last 5 years. I walked back to my office through the long corridor by the communications wing. I stopped at the window. The relay officer was there again. Different one from last time. She had a message open on her screen. Earth frequency. The message field was not empty this time. 2 words. When ready. She was reading it with an expression I recognized from my mirror that morning. I went back to my office and opened the database and started reading paper 12 of 47. Outside, the assembled fleet of 847 civilizations held position at the edge of human space, and somewhere in that space, something waited with the particular patience of an entity that had known this day was coming for a very long time. The silence from Earth had never been fear. We were only beginning to understand what it had been. My name is Counselor Maheen Sol, and I am an archivist. I need to say that first because what I found only makes sense if you understand what an archivist does. We find things. That is the entirety of it. We go into the deep stores of recorded history, the physical archives and the digital ones and the ones in between, that have been translated and retranslated across centuries, until the original language is 3 layers down, and you need a specialist just to confirm what format something was written in, and we find things that are there, and we record that they are there, and we make sure the record is accurate. In 37 years, I had never found something that was not supposed to be there. This is not a small claim. The Galactic Council archive contains records stretching back over 9,000 years. Physical materials, deteriorating organic fibers and inscribed stones and pressed alloy tablets, alongside digital records in formats that required purpose-built translation systems to access. I had spent 37 years in those stacks. I had found lost treaties, misdated transmissions, records that overturned historical assumptions about 6 different civilizations, one extremely awkward set of private correspondence from a former Grand Executor that we had quietly sealed and would not be discussing. I had found gaps in the record. I had found deliberate omissions. I had found errors. I had never found something that should not exist. Until the index card. I was in the physical archive at basement level 4 when I found it. I was there because the emergency council session had produced, among its various directives, an instruction that the archive division conduct a full review of all historical records pertaining to first contact events, specifically the early ones, the contacts from 9 centuries back when the council was younger, and its practices less standardized, and the records correspondingly messier. It was the kind of directive that gets issued in a crisis when people want to feel that systematic action is being taken. I did not object to it. A full review of 9 centuries of first contact records is exactly the kind of work I am here to do, and the crisis had not changed my feelings about the work. I was in the physical archive at basement level 4, in the section that housed materials from the period 4 to 5 centuries back, working through a box of catalogued items from the Cathori collection. The Cathori Empire was the largest single political entity this galaxy had seen in its recorded history. 9,000 solar systems under one central authority. Military power that made the current council's assembled fleet look like a regional police force. They had taken 412 years to build and 3 years to dismantle. Once the council decided they had become incompatible with galactic stability. That had been 412 years ago. The campaign against them was the council's greatest military achievement. We had studied it in council schools for 4 centuries. We talked about it at diplomatic functions. It was the example we returned to when we needed to remind ourselves, and each other, of what the assembled power of 847 civilizations could accomplish. The Cathori box contained the standard materials: administrative records recovered from their central archive after the campaign, diplomatic correspondence, military inventories, personnel files of senior Cathori officials, the kind of paperwork that empires generate, and that historians require, and that archivists spend a great deal of time carefully cataloging and preserving. And one index card. Physical, small, the kind of card that the oldest sections of our own archive used for cross-referencing before the digital systems were standardized, written by hand. I noticed it because it was slightly different from the others in the box. Slightly different material, slightly different aging pattern, a very small difference that I would not have caught in a less careful examination, and that I caught because 37 years of handling archive materials had given me a sense of these things that I could not entirely explain in words. I removed it from the box and looked at it. Written in Cathori. Cathori is a complex script, compound characters, significant grammatical information, carried in how the strokes connect. Not a language that casual outsiders typically wrote fluently. I read it twice to make sure I had the translation correct. 7 words. I will not write down what they were yet because I want you to understand the order in which I understood things, and the order matters. I photographed the card. I photographed it from multiple angles with my documentation equipment. Then I brought in 3 of the most senior xenolinguistic specialists in the archive, and I asked them, without telling them where the card had come from, or why I was asking, to date the physical material and confirm the language and the period. All 3 came back within 4 hours. They had reached the same conclusion independently. The card was 412 years old, give or take a margin of no more than 6 months. Written in fluent Cathori, which narrowed the authorship considerably, since Cathori was at that point an extinct language known only to specialists. 412 years ago. The Cathori Empire fell 412 years ago. I sat in my office with the photograph of the card, and I did the calculation that I had been not doing since I saw the specialists' reports. I did not want to do it. I did it anyway, because I am an archivist, and not doing calculations is not something I am capable of when the numbers are sitting in front of me. 412 years ago, humanity was on one planet. I know this because we have records. Not detailed records. We were not paying significant attention to a pre-spaceflight species at the outer edge of a quiet spiral arm, but enough to establish position. Humanity had not achieved orbital capacity in any consistent way 412 years ago. They had no vessels of any kind in deep space. They were, by every measurement we had, a strictly planetary civilization. Someone had written a card in fluent Cathori and placed it in the Cathori Central Archive 412 years ago. I contacted 3 more specialists, a historian of the Cathori period, a materials analyst, and a specialist in pre-spaceflight civilization development. I gave each of them, separately, different pieces of the information. I did not want any of them to know the full picture until I had their independent assessments. The materials analyst confirmed the dating, 412 years. The physical composition of the card was not Cathori in origin, which was interesting, but not impossible. Trade goods from outside the empire did appear in Cathori archives. The paper-like material the card was written on had some composition she had not seen before, but that she could not say was definitively from outside the known species catalog. She noted it was slightly odd. She did not know what to make of it. The Cathori historian confirmed that the script was not only fluent but precise. Whoever wrote it had an excellent command of formal Cathori, not administrative language, which was more complex and formulaic, but the kind of careful formal expression you would use in, for example, a note intended to be found by someone other than the author. The pre-spaceflight specialist told me that no known species currently in the Council had been capable of placing physical materials inside the Cathori Central Archive 412 years ago, while also being in a pre-spaceflight phase of development. He said this without knowing why I was asking. He said it the way an academic says something that is simply true, and that he expects I already knew. I thanked them all. I told them nothing more. I cleared my office, and I sat with the photograph of the card for a long time. Then I read the 7 words again. Tell your council, This was the test. I called the Grand Executor's office. Her assistant answered. I said I needed to speak to her immediately about something in the archive. The assistant said she was in session and could not be disturbed. I said I understood, and that I needed her to please tell the Grand Executor that I had found something in the Cathori collection, and that I believed it was related to the current situation. 11 seconds later I was on the line with the Grand Executor. I read her the 7 words. The line was quiet for a long time. Read them again, she said. I read them again. Tell your counsel, this was the test. Her voice had the quality I had heard in it during the emergency sessions, the quality of someone choosing each word with deliberate precision. Where exactly did you find this? In the physical Cathori archive, ma'am. In a box of materials catalogued as administrative records from the period of the campaign. Who else has seen it? I brought in specialists to date and analyze it. They do not know the context. They have the results of their own analyses and nothing more. What is the dating? 412 years, plus or minus 6 months. All 3 dating specialists agreed independently. Another silence. Longer. Mihin Sol, she said. In 37 years as an archivist, have you ever found something in the archive that you could not account for? No, ma'am. And in your professional judgment, in this specific case, is there any explanation for this card that you have not yet considered, and that might make it less significant than it appears? I thought about that carefully, because she deserved a careful answer, and because I had been thinking about it since I first picked up the card. I have considered every alternative I can construct, I said. A forgery placed recently by someone with access. A misidentified item from a different archive. A human speaker of Cathori, who found a way to the central archive through means we have not documented. I have constructed and examined each alternative. None of them hold up against the physical evidence and the dating results. And the one that does hold up is the one I called you about, I said. She was quiet for a long time. Come to my office, she said. Bring the card and all the documentation. I went. I brought everything. We sat in her office with the physical card between us on the desk and the specialist reports and photographs arranged beside it, and she read through all of it with the methodical attention of someone who has spent a very long career learning to understand things she would have preferred not to understand. When she finished, she sat back. 412 years ago, she said. Yes, ma'am. The humans could not have placed this here 412 years ago, by any technology or method we are aware of. Correct. And yet it is here. Yes. She looked at the card for a moment. Then she looked at me. The note says this was a test, the Cathori campaign, 412 years ago, the greatest military operation in this council's history. She paused. A test of what? I had been thinking about that since I found the card. I believe, ma'am, that is what the note is leaving for us to determine. She was quiet. And the current situation, she said. What we have done this past week, with the fleet, with the declaration. Do you have a theory about where that fits in relation to what this card is telling us? I thought about it very carefully. I think, I said, that the test may not have ended 412 years ago. She looked at the card for a long time. No, she said. I don't think it did either. She called a closed meeting of the senior council leadership for that evening. She told me to bring the card and the documentation, and to speak to no one until the meeting. I agreed. I spent the rest of the afternoon in my office with the photograph, reading it over and over, not because I needed to read it again, but because there was something I was trying to understand about it, that went beyond the words themselves. The card was 412 years old. It had been placed in an archive that was accessible only to those inside the Cathori Central Complex, in the heart of the most powerful empire this galaxy had produced, at the exact time that empire was ending. Someone had put it there knowing that one day, the council would look. Knowing that by the time we looked, we would need it to mean something specific. Tell your council, this was the test. Not a warning, not a threat, not a declaration. A message with a delay of 412 years, placed where someone knew it would eventually be found, by people with enough context to understand what it was saying. The question that stayed with me, the one I kept turning over through all the hours until the evening meeting, was not how or why or even who. The question was, if the Cathori campaign was a test from 412 years ago, What was the test for? And the answer that kept returning, quiet and persistent, and impossible to argue with, was that tests are not ends. Tests are preparations. Tests exist to determine whether a thing is ready for what comes after. 412 years ago, something had decided we were not ready. I held the card in my hands and thought about the 2 words the humans had sent to the council that morning. When ready. I did not sleep that night either. The negotiation room on level 3 of the council's diplomatic wing was designed for exactly this kind of meeting. Neutral colors. A table shaped so that no seat was technically at its head. Chairs of equal height. The windows set at an angle that meant no one faced direct light. Everything about the room said that whatever happened inside it, everyone was equal. Ambassador Kate Ellison knew all of this. She had read the Council's architectural standards for diplomatic spaces in a reference document available on their own public database, accessed 3 years ago during the preparation phase. She knew what the room was designed to make you feel, and she sat in it and let it try. She had brought 2 people with her, Captain Owen Hale, who commanded the human diplomatic security detail, and who had the specific quality of stillness that comes from someone who has been in difficult rooms before, and understands that nothing in those rooms is helped by visible tension, and Dr. Nadia Frost, who was technically listed on the delegation manifest as a cultural liaison, but whose actual function was to read the room, the specific configuration of 847 species, and their various nonverbal signals, and to give Ellison what she needed to make the right call at the right moment. There were no weapons in the room. The council had asked for this, and Ellison had agreed without discussion. Hale had noted, privately on the ship, that the agreement was easy to make because the most significant weapons the delegation carried were not the kind that rooms could be searched for. They had been waiting for 11 minutes when the council delegation arrived. Grand Executor Solène came in first. 4 arms, deliberate movements, the authority of someone who has occupied the center of a room for decades. Ambassador Vale Tor directly behind her. Councillor Brios and 6 others, arranged in the configuration that meant, according to the reference documents, a senior diplomatic engagement with significant political weight attached. Ellison stood. The council delegation took their seats. Ellison sat back down. She placed one folder on the table in front of her. Physical. Paper. She could see Vale Tor notice it, could see the small movement of his eyes to the folder and back to her face. She had learned early that the physical object in a room full of species that had moved to fully digital records created a particular kind of attention. It said, "This is deliberate. This is not accidental." Solène opened the session with the formal language of council diplomatic protocol, which Ellison knew by heart. Then Solène stopped speaking and looked at Ellison. Not a question, not an invitation. Just the look of someone who has spent a week revising their understanding of a situation and has arrived at this room with a great many things they need to say and a great deal of discipline about where to start. "Ambassador Ellison," Solène said. "Grand Executor," Ellison said. "You requested this meeting." "I did." "You were not invited to the emergency session." "No." "You attended anyway." "I did." Ellison let a moment settle. "I apologize for the disruption to your process. I thought it was time." "Time for what?" "Time to talk directly." Ellison looked around the table at the assembled faces, the different physiologies, the different ways that stress and attention and history showed up in bodies very different from her own. She had studied them for 3 years, not because she needed to read them as threats, but because you cannot negotiate honestly with people you have not tried to genuinely understand. We have been, all of us, talking around each other for 18 months. And we have spent the last week at the edge of something that none of us, I think, actually want. "You attacked our fleet," Vale Tor said. His voice was measured, not angry, precise. "We engaged your fleet when it crossed into human-claimed space after a formal declaration of war," Ellison said. "That is a legal distinction I want to be clear about, because the terms I am going to put on that table are built on it." Nobody spoke. She opened the folder. She removed one sheet of paper. She slid it across the table to the center. Vale Tor looked at it. Solène looked at it. Brios looked at it. Nobody picked it up immediately. Ellison waited. She had found, across 3 years of preparation and 18 months of formal engagement, that the most effective thing you could sometimes do was wait. Give people the space to think. Humans were often told that patience was a weakness in negotiation, a signal of desperation. She had found the opposite to be true. Patience, real patience, the kind that came from knowing you did not need the other party to hurry, was the most clarifying force in a room. Brios picked up the sheet. He read it. She watched his face. She had gotten reasonably good at reading Xernathi expressions across 18 months of interaction. She could not read them the way she read human faces, but she had learned the architecture of certain significant moments. Surprise, recalculation, the specific configuration that came when someone encountered information that did not match their existing model. That was what crossed Brios's face now. He passed the sheet to Vale Tor without speaking. Vale Tor read it and passed it to Solène. Solène read it in the particular way she read everything, carefully and completely, and then she read it again, and then she set it flat on the table, and looked at Ellison with an expression that Ellison had not seen from her before. Not hostile, not skeptical, not the carefully maintained neutrality of a diplomat managing a difficult session. Something more direct than any of those things. "Walk me through it," Solène said. Ellison nodded. She had the whole thing in memory. She did not need the paper. She had been building toward this conversation for 3 years, and she knew every sentence of what she was about to say. "We want a seat at the table," she said. "Full council membership, voting rights, treaty access, all the formal standing that any member species has. We want the observer status removed and replaced with full participation. That is the first clause," Vale Tor said. "It is also what you have been asking for 18 months. "Yes," Ellison said. "The difference is what is attached to it now." "The second clause," Brios said. "The second clause." Ellison looked around the table. "The Council will, within 90 days, release the full unredacted archive of all first contact events, dating back 1,200 years, including every contact, classified or otherwise, that touches on species now in this room." She paused. "Including us." The room was quiet. Not the careful diplomatic quiet of people maintaining composure, the different kind of quiet that settles when something has just been said, that changes the shape of the conversation. Vale Tor said, 1,200 years. "Yes. The archive goes back 9,000 years. We are asking for 1,200. The period we have reason to believe is relevant." Dr. Frost shifted slightly in her seat. Ellison did not look at her. She kept her eyes on Solène. Solène said, "What do you believe the archive will show?" Ellison considered the question carefully. "I believe it will show that the Council's records of its own first contacts are incomplete in specific ways, and that those gaps are not accidental." Silence. "And if we decline to release the archive," Vale Tor said, "then we are back where we were 8 days ago, with your fleet at the boundary and ours holding position, and neither of us has gained anything from the last 8 days, except a clearer picture of what the next 8 days might look like." She said it quietly, not as a threat, as a fact. There is a difference, and everyone in the room knew it. Solène looked at the sheet of paper for a long moment. Then she looked at Ellison. "You knew," she said, "before the vote, before the fleet. You knew how it would go." Ellison said nothing. "The silence," Vale Tor said. His voice had something in it that Ellison recognized as the specific quality of someone arriving at a realization while speaking. 3 weeks before the vote, you stopped communicating. We thought it was fear." "I know," Ellison said. "It was not fear." "No. What was it?" Ellison looked at him. "It was the last phase of preparation. Everything we needed to put in place before the engagement. We needed those 3 weeks to finish. The communication channel was the thing we could most easily suspend without it looking like preparation, so we suspended it." Brios made a sound that Ellison had come to understand as the Xernathi equivalent of a long exhale. "You made us think you had given up, or that you were afraid, so that we would vote." "We needed you to vote," Ellison said simply. "The declaration of war was necessary." The room was very quiet. "Necessary," Solène repeated. "If we had simply continued pushing for membership without it coming to this point, we would have gotten an observer status extension and another 18 months of the same conversations. We needed an engagement. We needed it to be short, contained, and clear enough that it could not be interpreted as ambiguous. We needed both sides to be able to walk away from it, with a very specific understanding. What understanding? Vale Tor said. That neither side wants what escalation looks like, and that the only reasonable outcome is the one on that paper. Hale, at Ellison's right, had not moved or spoken throughout the entire session. He had the stillness she had always found useful in rooms like this, the kind that people who are not trying to control anything tend to have. Solène picked up the sheet again. She read it for the third time. She set it down. "The Cathori," she said. Ellison looked at her. "We found the card," Solène said. "In the archive. An archivist found it yesterday." Ellison held Solène's gaze. She did not answer immediately. "The Cathori campaign," Solène said. 412 years ago. The index card in the Cathori physical archive. Written in Cathori." She paused. "Tell your council. This was the test." Another pause. "There is only one species that card could be from." Ellison said, after a moment, "I cannot speak to anything from 412 years ago." "Can't? Or won't?" "Both," Ellison said, without a trace of apology in it. Solène looked at her for a long time. Then something moved across her expression that Ellison, after 3 years of study, had to stop and translate carefully. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was, she thought, the expression of someone who has spent a week revising their understanding of a very long story, and has arrived, finally, at the part where the revision is complete. "How long?" Solène said. Ellison met her eyes. "Long enough," Ellison said, "that declaring war on us was never entirely your idea." The room did not make a sound. Captain Hale looked at the table. Dr. Frost looked at the table. Ellison looked at Solène, and Solène looked back, and between them was something that had the weight of 412 years, and also the weight of whatever came next. Vale Tor reached out and picked up the sheet. He held it in both hands and read it again, very slowly, the way you read something when you are committing it to memory, rather than just taking in the information. Then he set it down. He looked at Ellison. "The terms are not punitive," he said. "No," Ellison agreed. "They could be. Yes. You chose not to make them punitive. We chose to make them what they need to be," she said. "Not what we could make them. There is a difference." Brios said, very quietly, to no one in particular. This was the test. Nobody looked at him. The words sat in the room. Ellison slid the pen she had brought across the table toward Solène. Physical. The kind that left a mark you could see. Solène looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up. She did not sign immediately. She held the pen, and she looked at the sheet, and she held the moment the way you hold something you understand you will not get back once you release it. The room was completely still. 847 civilizations outside this room, and one pen and one sheet of paper, and one moment that was either an ending or a beginning, depending on which direction you were facing when you read it. Solène signed. She passed the pen to Vale Tor. He signed. He passed it down the table. Each member of the council delegation signed without speaking, in the quiet of a room where everything that needed to be said had already been said. When it came back to the center of the table, Ellison picked up the pen. She signed her name below all the others. Kate Ellison. Clear and unhurried, the signature of someone who had been working toward this moment for 3 years, and had no need to rush it now that it had arrived. She capped the pen. She looked up. Solène was watching her with an expression that Ellison still did not have a complete translation for. Complex. Several things at once. But present in it, somewhere, was something that she thought was possibly the beginning of something real. Not yet trust, not yet ease, but a recognition, the particular recognition that passes between parties who have both, finally, been honest about what they are. "The archive review will begin within 30 days, Solène said. "We will have our technical teams ready to assist," Ellison said. "There will be things in it," Solène said carefully, "that are complicated." "I expect so," Ellison said. "Most true things are." She closed the folder. She stood. Hale and Frost stood with her. "One question," Vale Tor said. Ellison looked at him. "The archive. The full 1200 years." He held her gaze. "Are we going to find more cards?" Ellison looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the folder. Read the archive, she said. That is where the answers are. She walked out of the room. Hail and frost followed. The door closed behind them. In the corridor outside, walking toward the diplomatic bay where their ship was docked, Hale fell into step beside her and said nothing for 30 seconds. Then he said, "They're going to read the archive." "Yes," Ellison said. "All 1,200 years." "Yes." They walked. Their footsteps were the only sound in the corridor. "How many cards are in there?" Hale asked. "Read the archive," Ellison said. He glanced at her sideways. "That is not an answer. It is the only answer I am authorized to give." She pushed the door to the bay open. Their ship was ahead of them, its running lights steady in the dock. "Owen." "Yes. We did what we came here to do." He was quiet for a moment. "We did," he said. She walked up the ramp. She did not look back at the council station behind her, at the 847 civilizations inside it, at the room on level 3, where a sheet of paper was sitting on a table with 9 signatures on it. She sat down in her seat. She pulled up the communication channel. She sent a single transmission back to Earth. No flourish, no ceremony. The kind of transmission that only makes sense to people who already know the context. 2 words. Phase complete. Then she closed the channel and looked out the viewport at the stars, at the particular arrangement of them she had grown up looking at from a small blue planet at the edge of a quiet spiral arm, and she thought about what her grandmother had told her once, when she was very young, and asking why they were sending people out to meet the council, when everyone knew the council was going to look down at them. Her grandmother had said, "The ones who look down never see what is standing in front of them." Phase complete. Outside, in the archive on level 3 basement, an archivist named Maheen Sol was beginning work on the first of 1,200 years of records. He would find 43 more cards before the end of the first week. Each one was a different language. Each one was dated differently. Each one had been placed in archives of civilizations at key moments in their histories, in locations that should have been inaccessible, written in scripts that required expertise to read. Each one said something slightly different, but all of them, in all 43 cases, ended the same way. Not with a threat, not with a name, with a date. The date was 4 months from now. Maheen Sol stared at the last card he found on the 7th day, the one at the bottom of a box of materials from a civilization that no longer existed, a civilization that had fallen 900 years ago under circumstances the archive had always listed as internal conflict. He stared at the date on the card. He called the Grand Executor. He did not need to say what he had found. She already knew. 4 months, she said. "Yes, ma'am. And we have no idea what happens in 4 months." "No, ma'am." He looked at the card. "But I think, based on the pattern, that whatever it is not something to be afraid of." She was quiet for a moment. "What makes you say that?" He thought about it carefully. "Because none of the cards are warnings," he said. "Every single one of them, across 900 years, 43 locations, 12 languages, is a message. Messages to people who will eventually be ready to receive them." He paused. "You don't leave messages for civilizations you intend to destroy." The Grand Executor was quiet for a long time. Outside the archive window, the station hummed around him. 847 civilizations, going about the business of existing, negotiating, disagreeing, building things, trying to understand each other, which was the specific and endless work of being alive, in a galaxy full of other lives. 4 months, she said again. "Yes, ma'am." "Get some sleep, Maheen Sol." "Yes, ma'am." He looked at the card one more time. Then he carefully placed it in an evidence sleeve, and logged it in the catalog, and turned off his workstation light. He did not sleep. He sat in the dark archive and thought about a species that had been leaving messages for 1,000 years, in languages it should not have known, in places it should not have been able to reach, to people it should not have been able to know would one day look. He thought about the kind of patience that required, the kind of thinking ahead that required, the kind of faith in the future that required. And he thought about 4 months from now, and what might happen when it arrived, and whether they would be ready. He thought the answer was probably yes. He thought the answer had probably always been yes. The date on the card sat in the dark with him all night. patient as everything else the humans had left behind, waiting for the moment it was supposed to arrive.